The first letter showed up 3 weeks after I finished the bridge. It came in a crisp white envelope with a gold embossed return address that read, Crescent Pines HOA Compliance and Infrastructure Division. That should have been my first red flag. I didn't even know there was an infrastructure division. I opened it with greasy fingers, still wearing my welding gloves. I'd just finished reinforcing the last set of beams under my new steel and wood hybrid bridge, the one I built, paid for, and sweated over for 6 weekends straight. Inside. A bill. $7,632 for shared bridge maintenance and structural upgrades. I blinked. Then I laughed, alone in my cabin kitchen. See, I bought this river cabin to get away from HOA drama. It sits at the far edge of the Crescent Pines boundary, technically within the HOA lines, but barely. The original access road washed out years ago, so I built my own bridge across a shallow part of the creek. Not a soul helped. Not a dime came from the HOA. I even pulled the permits myself after the county guy asked me, "Wait, you're doing that alone?" Now they wanted me to pay for maintaining the bridge that I built with my own 2 hands. The next morning, I drove down to the HOA office. It's in a beige stucco building next to the golf course, trying real hard to look like it belongs in a gated community instead of the middle of nowhere. The second I stepped in, I saw her, Zelda Zimmerman. HOA president, queen of pastel sweater vests and weaponized smiles. Her hair was sprayed into a helmet, and she had that look like she just caught someone parking an inch over the line. Well, Mr. Ryland Jacobs, she said, flipping through a manila folder with my name on the tab. We've been expecting you. Cut the dramatic crap, I said, walking up to the counter. You sent me a bill for a bridge I built myself. What kind of scam are you running? Zelda didn't even blink. That bridge connects directly to the community's emergency access route. Therefore, under Article 12, subsection C, it qualifies as shared infrastructure. There was no bridge there until I built one, I snapped, and it doesn't connect to any HOA-maintained road. It connects to my cabin. That's it. She gave me this sugary smile. Our legal team reviewed the situation. If you'd like to contest the invoice, you'll need to submit a compliance dispute form, Form 11A. There's a $25 processing fee. I stared at her, then laughed. You people are unbelievable. She leaned in with a fake whisper. You're part of the HOA now, Mr. Jacobs. We all have to do our part, even the rugged types. I left before I said something I'd regret. Back at my cabin, I pulled out the bridge permits, blueprints, and photos I'd taken during construction. Then I started digging county zoning maps, property lines, HOA bylaws. I found something. Zelda was lying. She knew the bridge sat entirely on my private parcel, and that emergency route. It didn't legally exist. It was a trail on paper, only never approved by the county. But the HOA had started calling it a route in hopes of forcing me into their little maintenance game. They wanted my bridge. And they wanted me footing the bill. They picked the wrong guy. The next day, I drove down to the county records office. The building smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee, and the clerk behind the counter looked like she'd been fighting paper cuts since the Nixon administration. But she was sharp. When I asked for the land survey archives and easement records for Crescent Pines, she pulled them within 10 minutes. I spread the documents across the table in the public records room, snapping photos with my phone as I went. My parcel was crystal clear, fenced in by creek bed on 3 sides and a narrow strip of forest on the 4th. The only access path was the bridge I'd built. No easements. No shared infrastructure. No mention of any emergency route, proposed or otherwise. Just a footnote in an old HOA proposal from 15 years ago, stamped rejected in red. I drove home with a folder full of facts and a fire in my gut. That night, I installed a trail camera facing the bridge, hidden beneath the cedar railings. Something about this whole situation felt off. I'd seen a few fresh boot prints near the creek the day before, way too close to my tool shed for comfort. I wasn't taking any chances. By morning, the camera had paid off. I reviewed the footage over coffee and nearly dropped my cup. At 2:17 a.m., a man in a reflective vest and work gloves crept across the bridge, knelt down, and screwed a small metal sign into the handrail. I paused the video and zoomed in. Property of Crescent Pines HOA shared emergency access. Unauthorized use prohibited. They were trying to fabricate ownership. I printed the photo, along with timestamps and metadata, and drove straight to the sheriff's office. Deputy Latham met me in the lobby with his usual half-interested drawl until he saw the footage. Then he stood up straighter. "Jacobs, this looks like tampering with private property," he said. "You file a trespass complaint yet?" "Not yet." "Figured you'd want to see this first." He nodded, grabbed his clipboard, and walked me through the paperwork. I filed the complaint under criminal mischief and trespassing. Latham said he'd drive out and take a look himself within 48 hours. Back at the cabin, I called a friend from my welding days, Lenny, who now worked as a structural engineer for the county. He agreed to come inspect the bridge and certify it as privately constructed and maintained, just in case the HOA tried to claim it was a community project retroactively. He showed up that Friday with a clipboard, boots caked in red clay, and a thermos of gas station coffee. "Damn fine work, Rylan," he said, tapping one of the main support braces. "Overbuilt, honestly. You could drive a tank over this." We walked the full span, and he photographed every weld, every bolt, every support. By the time he left, I had a signed report with stamped schematics and a notarized affidavit confirming I'd built the structure on private land, with no external funding or workforce. I dropped a copy off at the sheriff's office and another at the county zoning board. Then I sent a certified letter to the Crescent Pines HOA office, enclosing a cease and desist notice and a copy of the footage of their little midnight sign installer. For a week, there was silence. Then came the certified letter from the HOA's legal affairs liaison, a guy named Trent Mulrooney. The letter was thick, printed on high-gauge paper like they thought weight added authority. They were now accusing me of obstructing emergency infrastructure and endangering the community by refusing to comply with shared safety protocols. They threatened a lien on my property if I didn't pay the original amount plus a new, non-compliance penalty. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about the bridge. It was about precedent. If I got away with ignoring them, other residents might start pushing back too. I called my cousin Mara. She's an assistant district attorney over in Oak Ridge County and has zero patience for bureaucratic overreach. "This sounds like civil fraud and coercion," she said after I forwarded the documents. "Especially if they're trying to assign ownership where there is none. I'll make a few calls." 3 days later, a state investigator contacted me. Turns out, this wasn't the first shady stunt Crescent Pines HOA had pulled. Another resident had a similar story, fabricated fees for a community wildlife fence that didn't exist, but she'd paid out of fear and moved shortly after. The investigator asked if I'd be willing to provide my footage and documentation for a broader case. "You're damn right I'm willing," I said. Meanwhile, Zelda wasn't backing down. The next weekend, I caught her personally walking the trail near the bridge with 2 clipboard-wielding men in polo shirts. I watched from my front porch, coffee in hand, as she gestured dramatically toward my property line. I walked down and leaned on the post near the trailhead. "Afternoon, Zelda," I said. "Bringing city inspectors to your fantasy road." She turned, startled. "Mr. Jacobs, this is a formal inspection under HOA code. This land isn't under your jurisdiction," I cut in. "And those men aren't inspectors," I called the county. "You didn't file any permits for this visit." One of the clipboard men shifted uncomfortably. "Am I being recorded?" he asked. "Yup," I said, tapping my phone. "And so are you. My property, my rules." Zelda's lips pressed into a hard line. "You've made this unnecessarily difficult, Mr. Jacobs." I smiled without warmth. "You tried to steal my work, you snuck onto my land, you planted false signage, and now you're lying to your own board." You think I'm the difficult one? She stormed off without another word, the two men trailing her like nervous ducklings. That night, I emailed the state investigator everything: the footage, the new photos, the audio recording from the trail, and the full HOA correspondence. I didn't leave out a single detail. A week later, the subpoenas started flying. The county sheriff's office raided the HOA office for records. Turns out, Zelda and her board had been billing dozens of residents for projects that were never completed or didn't exist at all. The audit revealed over $80,000 in phantom maintenance charges in the last fiscal year alone. They froze the HOA accounts pending investigation. Zelda tried to blame it all on clerical errors, but nobody was buying it. Her legal affairs liaison, Trent, he vanished. Quit his post and skipped town the same day the subpoenas hit. The state flagged him for questioning. Deputy Latham stopped by my cabin the following week. "You might want to come to the next town council meeting," he said. "They're talking about dissolving the HOA charter altogether." I hadn't smiled like that in ages, but I wasn't done. Not yet. The Crescent Pines Town Council scheduled the emergency meeting for a Tuesday evening, and by the time I arrived at the community hall, the parking lot was overflowing. Cars lined the roadside, some halfway in the ditch. People stood outside the double doors, murmuring, clutching thermoses and folded lawn chairs. These weren't just the usual HOA meeting regulars. This was the entire neighborhood. I walked in with a manila folder tucked under my arm, filled with the last batch of documents. I'd gathered copies of the forged signage order, emails from HOA board members referencing creative billing, and a notarized letter from a former board treasurer who had come forward last week. She claimed she'd resigned after Zelda refused to let her view the breakdown of project expenses. Inside, the room buzzed with tension. The folding chairs were packed shoulder to shoulder, and the air smelled like polyester and old wood polish. Zelda sat at the front table, flanked by 3 remaining board members, all looking like they'd aged 10 years in the past 2 weeks. One man, who I recognized from the HOA newsletter as the treasurer's replacement, kept tapping his pen on a stack of untouched financial reports. Mayor Gregson called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of the gavel, though the noise barely cut through the chatter. "We'll begin with citizen reports," he said, adjusting his glasses and looking straight at me. "Mr. Jacobs, you filed for priority speaking rights. You have the floor." I stepped forward, unfolded my documents, and placed them on the podium. "The bridge they tried to bill me for sits entirely on deeded private land," I began, voice steady. "Built without HOA funding, manpower, or oversight. But they labeled it as shared emergency infrastructure to justify an invoice they had no legal right to issue." Zelda opened her mouth, but Gregson held up a hand. "You'll have your turn," I continued. "I have photographic evidence of unauthorized entry onto my property, including a staged installation of signage claiming HOA ownership. I've submitted all this to the state investigator, along with communications between board members suggesting they knew the emergency route was never formally approved." I held up a printed email with highlighted text. Here, one board member writes, "Technically, we can't enforce payment, but if we label the project as communal, most residents won't question it. That's fraud. And it doesn't stop with me." At that, a woman in the second row stood up without being called. "They billed me for a fence I never saw," she said. "Claimed it was for coyote mitigation. I live 2 blocks from the highway." Another voice from the back. "I paid over $4,000 for a shared drainage project. Turns out it was a culvert on Zelda's street." The room erupted. Dozens of voices cut through each other, names of fake projects, inflated invoices, unexplained late fees, all shouted into the thick air. Gregson banged the gavel again, louder this time. "Enough. This is now a criminal matter. We'll take statements one at a time, orderly, and submit everything to the county prosecutor." Zelda stood, her tone brittle. "These accusations are based on misunderstandings." Our records are complex, and some charges may have been miscoded. You authorized a lien on my home over a phantom sidewalk, said an elderly man near the middle row. There's not even a sidewalk within 4 blocks. That shut her up. Later that night, as the statements continued, 2 unmarked sedans pulled into the lot. The state attorney's office sent an official from the Public Integrity Division, along with a plainclothes officer from the county sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit. They quietly collected every document submitted during the meeting and requested digital files from the mayor's office. I stayed to the end. Almost 4 hours of residents lining up, some with folders, others with cell phone screenshots, every one of them echoing a similar story. Fees with no basis, invoices that couldn't be explained, threats of fines for non-existent violations. One man had even been billed for seasonal wildlife corridor restoration, which turned out to be a pile of mulch dumped in a drainage ditch. The following morning, local news vans were parked outside the HOA office. Someone, maybe one of the residents, maybe someone inside had leaked the investigation. A reporter tried to catch Zelda for a comment as she left the building, but she ducked into her car and drove off without a word. That afternoon, I received a call from the assistant district attorney assigned to the case. Her voice was brisk, clipped. "Mr. Jacobs, we'd like you to testify before the grand jury next week. Your documentation is central to establishing a pattern of fraudulent billing and misrepresentation of authority." I agreed without hesitation. The hearing was held in a quiet courthouse 2 counties over to avoid local influence or intimidation. I wore my cleanest flannel shirt, boots polished just enough to pass, and brought hard copies of everything. They walked me through each piece: permit filings, zoning maps, time-stamped footage. The jurors asked a few questions, mostly clarifying details about the bridge construction and the timeline of HOA communication. By the end of the week, the grand jury handed down indictments. Zelda and 2 board members were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful lien practices, and falsification of official documents. One count even mentioned attempted land encroachment via deceptive signage installation, which the state classified under property interference statutes. The 3rd board member resigned and cooperated fully. Turning over internal emails that confirmed the billing scam was a long-running operation meant to cover the HOA's mismanaged budget. An emergency council vote dissolved the HOA's authority pending the outcome of the criminal trial. Meanwhile, the residents of Crescent Pines began organizing a new model: voluntary, transparent, and with limited powers. I helped draft the charter, making sure no future board could ever claim ownership of private property without a recorded easement and unanimous vote from affected residents. The bridge, it stayed mine. I added a small plaque to one of the supporting posts. It wasn't flashy, just a steel plate with the words, "Private build, no HOA access, 2024. One afternoon, while I was resealing the wood railing, a couple in their 30s walked up from the trail side. They introduced themselves as the new owners of a cabin down the hill. They'd heard about the whole mess and wanted to thank me for standing up. "We almost backed out of the purchase," the husband said. "But when we heard what you did, we figured the community had changed." I gave a nod, wiped my hands on a rag. "It's not perfect, but at least now it's honest." They smiled, then walked across the bridge toward their place. No toll, no invoice, no fabricated maintenance charge. Just neighbors walking home. The trial began in early spring, just as the creek thawed and the bridge's support beams started humming again with the sound of rushing water underneath. I attended every proceeding, not because I had to after testifying, but because I wanted to see it through. There was something about watching justice unfold in real time that made all the late nights and early mornings of researching zoning codes and scanning old HOA newsletters worth it. Zelda sat across the courtroom, noticeably diminished. Gone were the pastel sweaters and the air of unchecked authority. She wore a dark blazer that didn't fit quite right, like she'd borrowed it in a hurry. Her lawyer, an out-of-town guy who looked more at home in a corporate boardroom than a county courthouse, tried to argue that the bridge billing was a misunderstanding, a miscommunication between departments. But the prosecutor wasn't having it. "You don't issue 5-figure invoices and install property signs in the dead of night because of a clerical mistake," she said during opening arguments. "You do that when you think no one's going to push back." The state's case was airtight. They had subpoenaed digital correspondence from HOA servers that showed Zelda personally approved a series of fabricated maintenance projects. One email, dated 2 days before I received my invoice, contained the line, "If we brand it as shared infrastructure, we can roll the cost across the board." It's not like anyone checks parcel lines. They introduced financial records showing that funds collected from those fake projects were used to cover a shortfall caused by a failed landscaping contract the board had signed the previous year. The company had walked off the job after not being paid in full, leaving the HOA with a mess and no recourse. Rather than admit the board's mismanagement, Zelda and her inner circle decided to invent infrastructure needs and spread the cost across unsuspecting homeowners. The worst of it wasn't the false billing, though. That came when the county technology officer testified that one of the board members had attempted to falsify digital parcel maps using a private GIS tool. They had created a doctored version of the neighborhood layout, showing my bridge as partially crossing into a community easement that didn't exist. That map had been printed, laminated, and handed out at the last annual HOA meeting before the investigation started. That was the final nail. The judge ordered an immediate audit of every HOA action taken in the past 5 years. The verdict came down in the 3rd week, guilty on all primary counts. Zelda was sentenced to 2 years in a minimum security facility with an additional 18 months suspended under probation. The 2 remaining board members received house arrest and restitution orders. The third, who had resigned and cooperated early, was given immunity in exchange for testimony. After the sentencing, the town council voted unanimously to dissolve the old HOA charter. The state appointed a temporary oversight committee to handle neighborhood functions until residents could elect a new voluntary board with no power to fine, lien, or issue compliance threats. The old HOA office was padlocked and later converted into a community lending library and tool shed. I didn't run for a position on the new board, but I did volunteer to help draft the bylaws. They were short 10 pages total. No member could hold office longer than 1 term, and no decision involving property could be made without unanimous consent from affected homeowners. The committee couldn't touch private land, couldn't charge fees without itemized public budgeting, and couldn't enforce anything without a public vote. It was simple, honest, exactly what it should have been in the first place. One warm Saturday in May, while I was replacing a few warped planks on the bridge deck, a group of neighbors gathered near the trailhead with folding chairs and coolers. I didn't recognize most of them. New faces, probably moved in after the scandal broke. A woman who'd bought the log house downstream waved me over. "We're doing a neighborhood potluck," she said. Figured it was time we all met without someone threatening to fine us for the shape of our mailboxes. I carried over a tray of smoked venison and set it on a folding table between a bowl of potato salad and someone's homemade lemonade. As people mingled, the conversation stayed light gardens, spring runoff, a bear that had been spotted near the edge of the woods. Not one mention of fines or regulations, no one looking over their shoulder. As the sun dropped behind the tree line and the creek glowed gold in the last light, a teenage kid picked up a guitar and started strumming. Someone handed out marshmallows. Kids chased each other near the fire pit someone had built out of old patio stones. Later that evening, the mayor stopped by. He'd heard about the gathering and came by to say a few words, not as a politician, just as a neighbor. "We've learned a lot from what happened here," he said, standing near the fire. About power and trust, and what happens when the people meant to protect a community start using fear instead. It won't happen again. No one clapped, no one needed to, we just nodded, understanding passing between us without needing to be said aloud. A few days later I got a letter in the mail. It wasn't an invoice. It wasn't a compliance warning or a demand for funds. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. Inside was a short note from one of the new residents, a young guy who'd just bought a place near the Ridge Trail. He'd heard about the bridge and the whole mess, and he wanted to say thank you. Tucked inside was a hand-drawn sketch of the bridge in charcoal, signed with his initials and the words "Built Right." I framed it and hung it near the door. The cabin's quieter now. The bridge holds steady, even during the spring floods. The sign I welded to the beam still shines in the morning light, untouched. And the creek keeps flowing, same as it ever did, untamed, unbothered.